You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
The word strategy gets thrown around a lot these days. It seems you need a strategy for anything, whether it be an amphibious raid, a corporate merger, or simply a road trip to the coast for summer holidays. We certainly have talked about it in a military sense on this show. However, the definition of strategy is often debated, and terms such as military strategy and grand strategy further complicate the concept for the average punter. Hopefully, this episode will clear up some of the terms, or at least one. G'day listeners and welcome to The Dead Prussian. This episode is going to be very, very interesting. We're stepping out of our usual fare of just military style topics and we're going into the bigger political scheme. As you know from our reading of Big Carl, because I know all the good listeners out there read Big Carl, war is supposedly a continuation of politics by other means. So let's talk about things that influence politics and what politics influences as well. Today we're going to be talking about grand strategy, and I decided to grab someone who knows a bit about it. Hal Brands is a Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He is the author or editor of several books, including Making the Unipolar Moment, US Foreign Policy and the Rise of the Post-Cold War, that was 2016. What Good is Grand Strategy? Power and Purpose in the American Statecraft, from Harry S. Truman to George W. Bush, 2014. Latin America's Cold War, 2010. From Berlin to Baghdad, America's Search for Purpose in the Post-Cold War World, 2008. And The Power of the Past, History and Statecraft, and that was co-edited with Jeremy Suri in 2015. He was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow from 2015 to 2016. He is also consulted with a range of government offices and agencies in the intelligence and national security communities. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Stanford University in 2005 and his PhD from Yale University in 2009. He previously worked as an assistant and associate professor at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy and as a researcher at the Institute for Defense Analysis. G'day Hal, how are you going? Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Mick. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you. You know, I'm a great fan, obviously, of the Dead Prussian himself, so I'm a fan of the podcast by extension.
Yeah, well, it's good that you're a fan of Big Carl, because he's a fan of this show, or he would be at least if he was alive. He probably wouldn't leave us an iTunes review, but I know the rest of my audience will. Now, Hal, you've written and teach a bit about grand strategy, which is quite lucky because that's today's topic. And before we get into it and we start talking about how we're going to define ends, ways and means of using national levers of power to coordinate political outcomes, that's just me showing off for the audience that I've read some things. I'd like to know what got you interested in national relations theory in general and grand strategy in particular.
Well, I suppose there's a boring answer and a more interesting answer to that. So the boring answer is that this sort of stuff was just kind of what was on the bookshelf when I was growing up, because my dad is a professor of American history as well, and American diplomatic history in particular, and so you know our living room was full of books about strategy and diplomacy and Bismarck and Eisenhower and all of the usual suspects. And so you know from the time that I could sort of read at a fairly advanced level, that's simply what I read. But maybe the more interesting answer, I guess, is that I showed up at college, my freshman year in college, about 2 weeks after September 11th, 2001. And it became very clear in that context that issues of war and peace, issues of international security, issues of international relations were going to be of truly pressing significance, not just sort of in an academic manner, but of truly pressing significance to the lives of people in the United States and elsewhere. And so I knew pretty quickly on that was what I wanted to study. And in particular, I've always been very taken with the idea that you really have to work to, so to speak, bridge the gap between academia and the policy world, and that there's a tendency for academics to kind of cloister themselves off and answer pie-in-the-sky questions that really don't have a ton of direct relevance to policy. There's a tendency for policymakers to be dismissive of the insights that some academics have to offer, and so I've really tried to position myself at the nexus of those two worlds and to connect them. And so, I've spent most of my time in the academic world. I've spent some time in the policy world as well. I just spent about 15 or 16 months working for Ash Carter, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, in the Pentagon on strategic planning issues. And so really, for the past 15 years now, working on issues of strategy and politics and war and trying to connect the academic to the concrete policy issues has been the defining theme of my intellectual pursuit.
It's a pursuit that quite mirrors the Big Carl himself. He was keen on trying to get military officers in the academic pursuits of studying, although I think he just liked to lock himself in a room and write and think about deep thoughts. At least we see you getting out there and working with the policymakers, which is something we always encourage for the friendlier academics. Those that aren't so friendly, it's probably better just to stay in the library or in your office. In your book, What Good is Grand Strategy? You run through some definitions of the term. Are you able to provide a general definition for our listeners?
Sure. So, I think grand strategy is one of the points I make in the book is that it's one of the most widely used and abused terms in the foreign policy lexicon. And one of the reasons for that is that it is very often used without being defined in any concrete way, or it will be defined by two different authors in widely varying terms. So sometimes it is thought to pertain only to sort of military political issues. Sometimes it's thought to pertain to things reaching even beyond foreign policy writ large. And so one of my main goals in the book that I wrote about this was to try to provide a little bit more of a precise definition of what grand strategy is and how it operates. And it's a little bit of a long definition, so bear with me, but I think it does a little bit of work. So the way I think about grand strategy is that it is the intellectual architecture that gives form and coherence to foreign policy. So if you have a grand strategy, you're not just doing foreign policy decision-making on an ad hoc basis or on a case-by-case basis. You're really taking a more structured and cohesive approach to international affairs. And in particular, if you have a grand strategy, you have a clear assessment of the following things. So the nature of the international environment, your country's highest interests and goals within that environment, the major threats to those interests and goals, and the major opportunities to advance them. And then finally, how you actually use finite resources to advance interests and to defend against threats. And if you actually have a grand strategy, these sorts of calculations don't just happen in a vacuum. They're not done purely for academic purposes. They actually drive policy decisions. So they drive how you use military resources, how you allocate foreign aid or other economic resources. In other words, your grand strategic calculations actually shape policy. And so you can think of grand strategy as an integrated scheme of interests, threats, resources, and policies. It's sort of the conceptual framework that we use for figuring out where we want to go in the world and then how we actually want to get there.
It's interesting because most of our listeners would be familiar with a military style of strategy. I mentioned before, ends, ways, and means. In fact, some of our listeners are responsible for implementing military strategies. From what you've said, there's a relationship between what would be considered a classical term of strategy, being military strategy, and grand strategy. What exactly is that relationship? Surely they're pretty much similar.
Sure. So I think the way to think about it is that military strategy is an integral part of, but still subordinate to, a grand strategy. So military strategy is essentially a program of ideas and action for the accomplishment of some military objective. But that exists in a larger foreign policy universe in a couple of senses. One, grand strategy encompasses not just the use of military means to accomplish military ends. It encompasses the use of all sources of national power, economic sources of power, ideological sources of power, diplomatic sources of power, so on and so forth, the whole framework. And then the second way in which I think grand strategy kind of is the umbrella under which military strategy occurs is that a grand strategy has to integrate all of the various regional or military or diplomatic strategies that a country happens to have. So I'll just use the example of the United States here. the United States has a military strategy for bringing about the military defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. But that military strategy is part of a larger grand strategy that encompasses American policy towards various regions, towards an entire range of international issues. And so it is a critical component of grand strategy, but what a grand strategy does is it brings all of the various discrete military strategies, regional strategies, together, hopefully, into a broader and coherent whole.
Okay, so that clears it up. I think if we were doing some sort of Venn diagram or something else similar to some of the diagrams Colin Gray's given us in some of his works, would have grand strategy as the superior and then the subordinate being military strategy. Then from there, for those military people, would probably go into the operational levels and tactics as well. So that makes that clear. However...
And I think if I could just add one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is the way you've laid it out is just right in the sense that this is precisely where the term grand strategy came from in the first place. And so, there had always been recognition that there was a tactical level of war. Later on, you get the operational level of war and then the strategic level of war. But it was really during the interwar era and mostly during World War II, at least in the Anglophone world, that academics and policymakers started saying, well, look, there's a realm of statecraft that occurs above all of these things. You might have a military strategy for invading France or for bringing about the defeat of Nazi Germany, but that resides under a broader conception of how you are going to win the war. And that broader conception has to do with economic mobilization, it has to do with alliance management, and the whole lot of things. And so to signify that this was something that occurred sort of even above the strategic level, that's where the idea of grand strategy comes from.
Which leads us quite nicely into my next question, because like many of my less astute listeners I need a practical example sometimes to understand the theory of something. So are you able to provide some examples, similar to those you have in your book, on grand strategy done well, and maybe an example of it done poorly?
Sure. So there are, one of the examples I like to talk about of grand strategy done pretty well comes from the Truman administration in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And I think what the Truman administration did was it defined some fairly concrete and achievable objectives, which happen to be things like the containment of Soviet power, the creation of a favorable balance of power on the Eurasian landmass, the integration of Western Europe and Japan into a U.S.-led international order, and then pursued a series of policies over an 8-year period that worked towards these objectives in a fairly effective fashion. And the fact that the Truman administration had a grand strategy didn't mean that they always knew what was coming tomorrow. In fact, there were lots of surprises. There was a lot of tactical improvisation along the way, and it certainly didn't mean that they got everything right, but it did mean that they had a basic sense of where they were going, that they had thought about how to apply the instruments of American power, first economic power, later military power, to achieve those ends, and that they were gradually able to make sort of incremental progress towards the objectives over time. And they did so in a way that sort of laid the foundations for a very successful post-war international order, and ultimately for U.S. And Western success in the Cold War. And so that's an example that I like to talk about as a good grand strategy. A grand strategy that I'm more critical of, although I think there is a need for a degree of empathy in discussing this, is the Bush administration's grand strategy after 9/11. So this is the Bush 43, the George W. Bush administration. And so this was obviously a grand strategy that was forged in a time of immense pressures and concerns after an unprecedented terrorist attack on the United States. But one of the arguments I make is that the grand strategy that emerged had two fatal flaws. One is that it was excessively ambitious in the sense that it set goals that were going to be extremely difficult for the United States to accomplish, even in the best of circumstances. And the obvious example here is not just the toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, but the transformation of Iraq into a flourishing democracy. That was going to be very difficult to accomplish under the best of circumstances. But then the second critique of the grand strategy is that the implementation simply just wasn't there until relatively late in the game. And so you can see this in the mismanagement of the occupation of Iraq after March 2003 and other things. And so it's an example of how if you don't get the goals right, and certainly if you don't get the implementation right, you can have a grand strategy. You can have a great inspiring vision of where you want to go, but it may actually lead you to grief.
And following on from that, I'm assuming there's a lot of people listening to this that would have followed the Bush administration quite carefully. There's a lot of us that have done service overseas because of some of those decisions made. However, it's always good to have a grand strategy as opposed to not. Would that be correct?
I think that's right, because the alternative to grand strategy is not good. Just in the sense that every country, every decision maker has to make grand strategic decisions, whether they realize they are doing it or not. So the United States has to make decisions about how to allocate resources across theaters, about what sort of military systems and platforms to invest in, regardless of whether its leaders sort of self-consciously go about constructing a grand strategy. And so one of the arguments I make in the book and elsewhere is that if you accept that you have to make these type of decisions anyways, then you might as well try to make them in as coherent and structured a fashion as possible. And so if you sort of think of the problem in that sense, then there really is no alternative to at least trying to do grand strategy. Now, you have to recognize that it's going to be difficult, it's going to be messy, it's going to be fraught, even in the best conditions. But the alternative to doing grand strategy is a sort of grand strategic nihilism, which I don't think gets you anywhere.
Yeah, I guess I'll wing it, or I'll just do it on the day, won't cut it when you're at those levels of decision making. Now, Hal, my final question is one that every guest on the show gets it. And it's related to our mission on the show. Being a fan of Big Carl himself, you'll understand this mission. It's to define war in as many ways possible. A lot of our guests try and define it in 140 characters. That's because it makes it easy to tweet. Now, I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is.
Well, I will. I don't know if I can do it in 140 characters, but I promise to be brief. War is a tragic but inescapable aspect of international politics. And if we forget either the tragedy or the inescapability of it, we do so at our peril.
That's a good definition. I think I could almost squeeze the first bit into a tweet. We'll have a look at that, and there's a lot of shorthand that can be used on the Twitter sphere. I know that because the show's pretty big on the Twitter sphere for those listeners that didn't know and aren't on Twitter. Hal, thank you very much for coming on the show. For those listeners that haven't picked up his book, I managed to get the electronic copy and also the audiobook version as well to listen to it while I was driving to the coast, because I had the strategy on how to get to the coast and occupy myself at the same time. It's called What Good is Grand Strategy? It's very, very good for those people that need practical case studies to understand broader theoretical concepts. So if you're looking for a book that isn't mired in lots of academic theory and no practical concepts, then this is the book for you. I very much enjoyed it. So Hal, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mick. It's been my pleasure.
All right, listeners, that's it for our definition and discussion on grand strategy. Hopefully that was a good listen for you. If not, then I don't really mind as long as you jump on iTunes and give me 5 stars. Anyway, I'll also be rolling out more and more of the other format shows, which are the 5 to 15 minute episodes reviewing a book, film, TV show, anything related to war that takes my fancy and I think that the listeners can benefit from. Why do I do this? Because it was once said that if you read what everyone else is reading, you're going to think like everyone else. So I'm going to try and get you all to think like me. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.